Hello everybody, welcome back to another video with Lim Reviews. Now, the Poco X3 GT was just launched a couple of days ago. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing the Poco X3 GT against its predecessor, the Poco X3 Pro. Now, I have both devices on my table today, and I've been using both devices for quite some time now. So again, in this comparison video, it's definitely going to be my perspective based on an actual user of both devices right here. Alright, so as you can see from the title above, there are 8 different upgrades that you can expect from the Poco X3 GT. Although it might not be that obvious, but I think that you should definitely take note of these differences here. Alright, so before we start off the video, I'm just going to talk a bit about the price. The Poco X3 GT here is retailing in Malaysia for RM about 1,600, and I'm talking about the top spec variant that I have here. Whereas for the Poco X3 Pro, it is about 1,300 ringgit. So in between both devices here, there is about 300 ringgit of difference. And if you're in other regions of the world somewhere else, in terms of US dollars, it is about 70 US dollars between both devices right here. So again, like I mentioned, there are 8 different upgrades that you can see on the Poco X3 GT. Now, before I do that, before I go into the full in-depth details here, if you have been to the channel, if you've seen these videos before, please do support the channel by giving a like and a sub. That would really help out the channel. Alright, so now let's just jump into the 8 upgrades that you should take note of right away. So first up, in terms of design, let's talk about design very quickly right here. Notice that on the Poco X3 GT over here, it is a much slimmer design. It is very sleek. In fact, it is a slightly smaller device compared to the Poco X3 Pro right here because it has a 6.6-inch display, whereas this is a 6.67-inch display. So very small difference here, but the way it feels, the slimness is just much better in hand compared to the rather chunky Poco X3 Pro that I have here. So that's the first difference. Now the second difference I'm going to talk about here is in terms of connectivity. So you can't see that directly from the devices itself, but the Poco X3 GT here, it offers dual 5G. So obviously, I know that not every country right now supports 5G, but if you want to future-proof yourself, the X3 GT here offers dual 5G, and that's great because on the X3 Pro right here, it only supports dual 4G. So this is something that is also very important that is not really highlighted in all the reviews that I've seen online today. Alright, now let's move on very quickly to the next point, and that is the differences in the displays. So first up, again, on paper, you might see that these are actually very similar devices here. We have 1080p displays, LCD for your information, and of course, both these devices have 120 Hz high refresh rate as well as a 240 Hz touch sampling rate here. So it's very similar in terms of the resolution, the sharpness levels, the refresh rate, as well as the sensitivity on both devices. In fact, they both have the same brightness levels. So what is actually different here? Now again, this is not something that you can see, and that is actually in the protective levels of the display itself. So on the Poco X3 GT right here, we're having the Corning Gorilla Glass Victus. Now that is a very high level kind of protection over for the Poco X3 GT. It offers much better drop protection as well as scratch resistance compared to the Poco X3 Pro over here, which only uses the Corning Gorilla Glass 6. So that's another difference that you need to take note of. Now moving on to my next point here, the fourth point that you need to take note of, and that is a difference in terms of the processors that we have in these guys right here. So again, you might already be aware, this Poco X3 GT here runs on the Dimensity 1100 5G, whereas on the Poco X3 Pro, it is running the Snapdragon 860. Now, in terms of benchmark scores, let me just show it to you very quickly right here because I've done it already, and take a look at the scores for the Geekbench right here. So notice that on certain occasions, I actually got a lower score for the single core score, whereas I got a higher score for the multi-core score here on the Poco X3 GT. Now, however, the highest score that it was able to get was 780 and 2712. So in terms of outright performance, I would say that both devices are actually very similar in terms of day-to-day use. In terms of gaming, it is also very similar, and you can probably see about a 10% increase in terms of performance coming from the Poco X3 GT here. So that is again another upgrade that you should take note of. Alright, the next thing that you should take note of, the fifth point here, and that is about the cooling system. Now, in this guy right here, the Poco X3 GT, it is using Poco's latest liquid cooling 2.0, whereas on the Poco X3 Pro right here, it is using the liquid cooling 1.0 plus. So now the difference between the cooling systems here, you can't really see it again, but in actual gaming, you notice that the temperatures are slightly less hotter on the Poco X3 GT right here. So apparently, according to Poco, they said that there is this like a vapor chamber inside this guy right here. So it offers slightly better cooling with that on the Poco X3 GT. So that's again another upgrade for you that you should take note of. Alright, now moving on to the sixth difference here between both devices, and this one is actually a very important one, and that is in the haptics engine. Now, the Poco X3 GT here uses the X-axis haptic system, whereas on the Poco X3 Pro, this is using the Z-axis haptics engine. So what's different here? What is the difference between X and Z? Now, the X-axis is actually reserved for more premium devices. That means when you type on this device right here, the haptics, it gives you those shorter and crisper vibrations that is just so much nicer to feel. And where would you actually experience this most of the time? And that is in your typing on the keyboard. So it offers a very nice and short, crisp kind of vibrations when you just type on the keyboard. So on the other hand, for the Poco X3 Pro right here, again, it's not using the worst haptics, it's using a Z-axis, but it's just not as short, not as crisp as the haptics engine on the Poco X3 GT. So that's the next thing that you should know of. Now, let's move on to the seventh difference here. We're almost reaching the end. If you're still staying with me, thank you guys for staying with me. Let's talk about the next difference here, and that is in their cameras. So obviously, when you take a look at both camera setups here, you notice there is a huge difference already. On the Poco X3 GT, we have a triple camera setup, whereas on the X3 Pro, we have a quad camera setup. So what's different here? Let me focus on the main sensor. So we have a 64 megapixel main sensor unit on the X3 GT, whereas on the Poco X3 Pro, we have a 48 megapixel main sensor. So right away, you can tell that the resolution is a little bit higher on the X3 GT right here. And let me just show you guys a couple of photos so you can just see the difference in the quality yourself. Again, I would say that the quality of images coming out from both devices are actually very similar. But if you look closely, you'll notice there is a slightly sharper, a better picture reproduction coming from the Poco X3 GT with its 64 megapixel sensor right there. So again, take a look at these photos and let me know what you guys think. But I would still look at this as a small upgrade. Alright, now let's move on to the final one, the eighth difference or the eighth upgrade that you can see on the Poco X3 GT, and that is in the charging speeds. Now, both devices here have very large batteries. We have a 5000 mAh battery here, and I think this is like 5.1K-ish mAh battery. But in terms of charging speeds, now this X3 GT supports up to 67 watt fast charge, whereas on the X3 Pro, it is only 33 watt fast charge. And the difference is quite major. From 0 to 100%, it only takes the X3 GT 42 minutes, whereas on the X3 Pro, it takes it about 59 minutes. So about 20 minutes longer for the X3 Pro to charge to full. Alright, so those are the main upgrades that I can say you will see on the Poco X3 GT here. Those are the 8 key upgrades that you need to know of that you might not see on the devices itself. A lot of them are hidden, but I hope through this video, you are able to tell what's different and what you are actually getting for that extra 300 ringgit or 70 US dollars. Now, one final bonus one here, and this is in the side of the Poco X3 Pro. There's one thing that is better on the X3 Pro right here that I would say, and that is in the speakers itself. So both devices here actually have dual stereo speakers, but the one on the X3 Pro is just a little bit louder. It is much richer as well, and you do feel some vibrations on the back when you actually pump the volume up to maximum. It is not to say that the X3 GT has a poor dual stereo speakers. They're both great, but the one on the Poco X3 Pro is just slightly louder, and I prefer the sound quality coming out from here. Another thing that the X3 Pro does a little bit better is the fact that it retains the headphone jack, guys. So I'm not sure how much you value the headphone jack, but if you're the kind of person who wants to use a headphone jack, yep, the X3 Pro has it. The X3 GT, say sayonara. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you learned something from this video today. If you like the channel or support the channel, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, a sub, and I hope you see the differences, the 8 different upgrades from the Poco X3 GT here over the X3 Pro. Alright guys, thanks for staying up to the end of this video. I hope you're all staying safe, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Take care everybody. Bye!